Welcome back, everybody. What a stimulating and engaging start to this conversation of does art work? Feels like a redundant question after such powerful presentations, but we're going to get into it with some questions and answers. I am Lisa Anderson. As Johnny mentioned at the start, I'm the newest addition to Messums, and it's such a thrill and an honour to be able to contribute to an organisation that's so committed to socially engaged art and the value of creative practice. So, without further ado, I'm going to open up the questions with a couple of my own, and then, as Johnny mentioned, we have been allowing for people to contribute to the conversation online as well. So I'll go online to one of the questions there, and then of course give you, the audience in the crowd, an opportunity. I'm sure you're brimming with questions. If you're not already, please do think of some to pose to our esteemed speakers this morning. Okay, so my first question to everybody here is you presented examples of how art transforms lives in different contexts, whether it's in the prison context, as an artist in the classroom, or within conflict zones. What to you is the common denominator that makes art work across all these contexts? I thought I'd start with an easy question. Who'd like to kick off?
Yeah. I will pick up.
Thank you.
This morning.
Yes.
And you've done it. No, I think, I'm not going to get to answer the question in a sense. What I'm going to say that the common denominator, you saying, why does it happen or how does it happen? And I think it's providing, and actually Victoria talked about it anyway, it's providing an area of space where people feel out of their normal world. They've gone into a different world. They've entered somewhere. So particularly if they're troubled people, but anyone, they will go into their studio. You can disagree, and they are somewhere else where they can think freely. And this is extraordinary change, can have an extraordinary change to attitudes if you don't have all the things that are usually pressing on you, holding you there. And I'm not thinking of mental hospitals and prisons now. I'm just thinking of everyday life. So that would be mine, making that space, which of course you do so brilliantly.
Well, would you like to pick up on that, Victoria? Because I'm sure everybody can agree it was so moving to see those images of art transforming people through that experience of play and theatre making. You could see the joy on the faces of those children and get a sense of the sense of freedom and kind of escape from the trauma of reality that they were experiencing as a result of that opportunity.
I've got two thoughts, and I think they're kind of unconnected, both of them. One thought is about, I always come back when I'm thinking about why is art important? Why does it matter? For some reason, to something which had nothing to do with work. I was in Lebanon, and there was a Syrian labourer who was in the home of my great aunt, my husband's great aunt. My husband's Lebanese. So he came, and his village had just been bombed, and he'd lost many members of his family in Syria. And he came and was very positive in helping out around the house, and he was doing some painting and stuff. And then he sat down and he told me that he was a poet, and he told me that every night he finishes his work and he works these sort of 15-hour days, and then he gets back to his refugee camp and he sits and he writes poetry on his own. And I just remember him saying that, and he came and sat down on the sofa next to me and told me this in a very sort of proud, dignified way. And I just remember thinking that this process of him seeing himself as a poet was deeply dignifying. So maybe it's something about this seeing yourself as an artist and having this identifier that puts you that is deeply leveling and puts you in a different category to what your economic means or your economic status might give you. maybe. And then the other, and then I just wanted to come back to what you were saying, Johnny, about at the very beginning, this provocation about how maybe it's the process that makes art work rather than the end result. And that's something that we think about a lot at Scenario. And my answer to that is that I think you need in order for the art process to be genuinely kind of liberatory, I think you need a really dignifying process, as I've just been talking about. And then I think the product is important. We witness that a lot in the work that we're doing. If we end up with a play that is half-hearted and nobody really knows their lines and it's all a bit rubbish, the participants can tell, they're not fools, and that is less dignifying and it's less empowering, I think. So yeah, just something about having this kind of participatory, empowering process combined with a product that has quality, however that quality might express itself. Rachel, you were talking about it doesn't need to be a Picasso, but I think there needs to be some kind of pride in the final product.
Yeah, and I think that I felt sad I hadn't thought of theatre, because a lot of theatre goes on inside prison. And it is very, very helpful in that.
Well, Nicola, you spoke really movingly about the art making process from the artist's perspective, and you starting off with that image of the young child making those marks and affirming themselves and getting a sense of their own autonomy as part of that process focused sense of the value of art. And you did say that it's not always about the results. So I'm interested to hear. And obviously, as an artist who is successful, you do know about the result. But yeah.
There's so many thoughts.
No.
Amazing deeds they're doing. I think one of the sad things for me is that, I do genuinely believe that first act of holding a crane.
Yeah.
Sorry. And so obviously I'm a little jinx. I do apologise. It is, I honestly think it's the first moment in life when you are what they now call present. You are actually present. You're making something happen for no reason, in the joy of doing it. And I think something that, from an artist's perspective, I feel genuine sorrow about is that all children, this is going to sound hackneyed and cliche, but it is a truth. All children thrill at making art, even if it's, fuzzy felt shapes being stuck on. Not everybody is dexterous. And the great tragedy is when judgment comes into it. There's a certain point at school when you say, it doesn't look like a dog, I can't make it look like a dog, I'm going to stop drawing dogs. And that is heartbreaking, because for so many people, it's nothing to do with anything, it's just part of development. That's where their art practice stops. And for those of us that I had the support of an artist family, for instance. Art was something that happened in our house. I didn't have to fight to find it. It was there. And I am fully aware of how lucky and blessed I am. But if you can keep children going past it doesn't look like a dog, you're really getting somewhere. So yes, to see the way Johnny has presented the work
Of Zena Holloway. Yes, what is such fantastic inspiration behind us. Yeah,
there's a frame. A frame gives you a pause. You can go into the picture without assessing the edges or the size or anything. That is huge. So, but for me, how do we get over the judgment just to keep kids going with their art?
I think you've all spoken to the sense of aliveness that being in that artistic process brings forth, being present. That is about understanding our humanity. And that is a gateway into compassion, isn't it? And empathy. And when that moment of a teacher's judgment of a picture not being right, it kind of kills that compassion and sense of empathy. So that's a leeway into one of the questions that came from online from Sarah Needham, who's asked this for all the speakers. What is the role of art in creating ecologies of compassion within the context of an increasingly fractured world?
Questions. Can I have a go at that one?
Please do, yes.
So I think it's really important that artists go into their studio with no intention of reaching anybody, doing anything, making anything that looks like anything. You go into your studio with all your experience, all your knowledge, all your mistakes, all your disasters, and you try and make something happen. If you make something happen, at that point, you can use it to communicate with. At that point, once you've made it, you can share. But if you go into a studio saying, I'm going to make a piece to talk about this, it's a little bit like illustration. It's very hard to do successfully. There are people who do, but it's hard to do. So I would say, from an artist's point of view, you make, you show, you talk, not the other way around.
Interesting. Do you have anybody else have?
Well, I think it's maybe an easier question for me to answer when it comes to theatre, because theatre is so profoundly collaborative and so profoundly about a relationship between a group of people on stage and then the relationship of that group with the audience. One thing just to say is that so often in the groups that we're working with, it's a very, very diverse group, and we deliberately choose participants who come from, different sectarian backgrounds, identities that are often in conflict with each other, women and men who, maybe from conservative communities or less conservative. So really diverse groups. And I defy anyone to take part in, 15 theatre workshops where you're creating with your body a monstrous creature as all these participants together, and then you're sharing personal experiences about your childhood, and then you're imagining different futures. I defy anyone to go through that process and not have a sense of compassion for the people that they're working with. So I think, in a sense, it's an easier question for me to answer.
Perhaps you have a view, which.
Well, in a way, I was just thinking, I don't think it strictly fits into the art, but the time when I noticed projects in prison, choirs, for example, and I went up to prison, Stafford Prison, to see a choir in action. And it's really what Victoria's talking about. And I went into this porta bin, or whatever they're called, or are those lavatories, or a
Portaloos.
Portaloo. Oh, no, it wasn't a Portaloo. It was a non-Portaloo, but it was very like one. Anyway, there were 15 men in there, so it definitely was a Portaloo. There were 15 men in there, and I've never seen more miserable men of all ages. And it was a sort of horror sight. And I actually thought I was in the wrong place. I couldn't believe these were members of the choir who were about to rehearse for a concert they were giving in the chapel in HMP Stafford. And the chap who arranged it appeared with his assistant, and he said, right, now we'll begin by doing our warm-up. And the men sat a bit straighter. They'd all been sort of slumped, looking like dead people. The man next to me, I was sort of included in the group, was 91. And there was another one who was 35 and had been a pop star. They were a real range, and they were all down in the dumps. So he said, now we're going to warm. And they all suddenly sat a bit straighter. So I thought, oh. And then he said, so they all went, and suddenly their eyes opened a bit further. And then he said, right, now we'll start. What is that one? For every flower, bee sings, for every... No, I can't remember. Anyway, it's a lovely sort of hymn song. And they were singing it in 3 parts. And they were absolutely incredible. And I could not believe the same people. Moreover, whereas before it started, none of them had talked to any of the others. They'd had nothing. They were just locked into themselves. The moment they'd done a bit of singing, suddenly they were treating their neighbours like their best friends. And it completely transformed their lives. It was incredibly moving, actually. I found tears in my eyes as I looked through the barbed wire of the window in this porta bin or whatever it was. And I think it is the same thing as I've had it again when I've gone into art classes or writing classes or whatever it is, that the group really do learn about what your question is asking about compassion. But I'm not sure that in a way they're learning it by sitting down and doing what they're doing. It is the companionship.
The companionship and the power of that creative act in unison. I think my reflection on it is that it's not the artist's responsibility to engender those thoughts of compassion, but it's a route into a conversation. That's the power of art. And it's the context within which we experience art, whether it's in that choral context, whether it's in that theatre, or, from my perspective as a curator, the conversations we can start by putting different artwork into conversation with each other. I think that can bring those insights.
Could I just, one thing I was thinking is that there's a difference between compassion and pity, I think. And so Rania, who I showed that short video of, grew up in this orphanage, and she was doing her first production, which I directed, was with a group of Palestinians who had grown up in Shatila refugee camp in Beirut. They'd grown up, the orphanage and Shatila are like a 10-minute walk from each other. They're very, very close. But neither had ever been anywhere near each other's homes. And they told me, I remember throughout the process, that at the beginning, they each pitied and feared each other. So the Palestinians were saying, "Oh, you poor children who grew up with no parents, and don't really know what goes on in orphanages, and I'm not going to go anywhere near there." And then, in turn, the guys who grew up in the orphanage were saying, "Oh, poor Palestinians, they don't have rights in Lebanon," and the reputation is that those camps are sort of dens of crime, and we're not going to go anywhere near them. And what was interesting, I think, is through this theatre process, that pity was then transformed into compassion. So they now still have sleepovers at each other's house the whole time, and go and have lunch together and know each other's families.
What a beautiful ripple effect of the creative process. All right, the time has come to offer you all the opportunity to ask a question. I saw one eager hand go straight up.
Hi, thank you so much. I think you're beginning to answer the question, does art work? As a pedagogue, a Froebel trained educator at one point, I'm exceedingly concerned about the arts within the educational system and about the child poverty with this in the UK at the moment. And how on earth do we persuade our governments of the importance of art as a vehicle for mental health, for spiritual development, to be at the centre of the educational system, not on the periphery, or on the, it's diminishing. My daughter's an art teacher, and the lack of paper, the lack of crayon within the schools is shocking. And what Jamie Oliver with food, but what do you suggest? I have a very good friend, Kate Malone, who is an amazing ceramicist, and she runs a program where ceramicists donate work regularly at auctions, and she collects the funds to open ceramic centres in deprived areas. And she not only opens the art room, she provides the kiln, she provides the teacher. That's all being done by ceramicists. And I think actually we've probably got to a point in our history where we artists need to step up and do what we can. I stopped teaching quite a long time ago because I could not support the art education that was on offer in most art schools. I found it too distressing. I wasn't given enough time or resource ever to properly teach, which is a degree of dismantling and rebuilding. I couldn't bear just to go in and okay things, but I am now in a position where I could do something. I follow Kate's lead, and I think it might be up to the art community. I don't think the government has ever been any good at saving the arts, providing for the arts. It's possibly not what they're possibly not even what they're there for. I think it might be up to us.
Can I disagree with you? Yes, absolutely. And I think what you're saying is completely right and wonderful. And I may say in prisons, almost everything is done by private trusts and charities. But I think, rather like our questioner, I think this is absolutely disgraceful. This is absolutely up to the government. I think it is what the government should be doing. And you're not allowed to.
But they're not doing it.
We're not doing it. And therefore, we must all, anyone who can, must fill what we can, do what we can, but that doesn't mean the government should be let off the hook. And I think the so-called Arts Council, what's happening to that? I mean, I was very struck at the Wigmore Hall, and it's literally turned down money from them. I know this isn't schools, but turned down because it came with so many caveats, so many duties. It wasn't about music. It was about other things. And I think something's gone very wrong. Partly it has to be the caliber of our politicians who don't go to art galleries. I don't think they often have, but I think they're particularly bad at the moment. They don't go to the theatre unless they're doing it to be photographed or something. So, and as far as I remember, you can put me wrong, but I mean, you can tell me I'm wrong. We used to have something called an arts minister, minister of the arts, and then I think he got put with sports. Didn't he get put with sports and something else? And so arts has gone down and down. It wasn't always like this. And schools is particularly important. I mean, the 3 grandchildren of mine, the 3 of them went to a very good state school, which had wonderful music and arts. And in fact, one of my granddaughters doing 2 of my grandchildren did A-level art. And you'll find pockets of very good schools where they're well taught and it matters. But as you rightly say, far too many, and I don't exactly know, apart from going and knocking on 10 Downing Street's door and say, what about the arts? One can do.
Well, I must counter you. I completely agree with you. Obviously, it ought to be the state. Of course, it ought to be the state. All our children, all our teenagers, all our students deserve support from the state. Of course, they do. But it's not happening, and we can't wait. When I went to art school, I was taught by artists, as I mentioned, and it was it was the most incredible system. As a professional artist, you taught 1 or 2 days a week in an art school or 2 art schools, and that funded your practice. And that meant that students had the very best of active working artists, teaching them, showing them. You couldn't, if you worked 5 days a week in an art school, you wouldn't be able to pay your rent and your studio rent. The system is shot. I can't wait for the government to pick up the baton. If we wait any longer, there simply aren't going to be the people who remember how well it worked to keep the system going.
I don't think we should wait. I completely agree with you. But I don't think we should either. We should give up altogether.
But arts ministers have always come from sport there's never been a proper respect, not since Alan Bowness, for arts in politics. It just hasn't.
No.
I think the 2 of you actually are agreeing that. No, but this is the debate that goes on in society. You know, who should take responsibility for this issue? I love that it's been invoked here that, artists themselves have a responsibility to share their experience, their knowledge of the impacts of art, to mobilize change. I think there is something about us at this particular moment being much more proactive in mobilizing a community of people who believe the same thing and getting resources together to invest into art, but also empowering the government with an understanding about the value of art they're clearly disconnected from. That is a major gap. Do you have anything to add, Victoria?
Well, only that, as someone who runs a non-profit, as I said, that needs to raise funds and therefore needs to prove the value of arts, is something that we always talk about. And I think that there's a real split in the kind of art world globally between do we try to justify this expenditure on arts based on basically economic output, and that we started doing this big study with pro bono economics about how much, if you put £1 pound into our work, how many values we get out, and what value for money do you have? And then I think what the question that we're trying to answer today, which is more intangible and I think more interesting, which is the kind of really profound self-realization and personal transformation happens throughout. So I guess that's the question for me, is like, how are we justifying this expenditure, and on which side do we want to take?
Well, I have one final question for online that kind of speaks to this question. It says, and it's from an anonymous questioner, art is important on an individual level. Do you think there is a role for those who largely consume art, brackets, upper or upper middle class, perhaps wealthy, close brackets, to ensure that there is funding available for those who need it?
Yes, yeah.
That was easy. I don't think there's much to be said to that. But are there any more questions from the audience? Yes, this lady over here in the green and white.
I'd just like to make a comment about, you were talking about the education system. What I don't understand is generally teachers don't like the way they're being told to educate. Why don't they get together and say what we all know, that there needs to be more art in schools, there needs to be more sport, there needs to be some more natural teaching, not the way they're doing it at the moment. And it's just so frustrating to see it happening. But so much creative talent out there, so you can capture it.
Yeah, I
Doing it.
sorry. I just think of that before we get on to asking. In a way, I was thinking of this because my editor for my last few books has stopped being an editor to my rage and has become a teacher. And she's been very interested coming in as a clever someone who's been working with people, writers a lot, coming into the school and finding her hands tied very often, just the way you describe it. And she is working within the school she's in Lewis, near Lewis. No, Ashford, around that area. But she's doing everything she can and finding like-minded people, doing exactly what you describe, so that she doesn't have these tick box things when she's teaching writing, so-called creative writing, so that children have a much freer idea, getting whole books rather than bits of books, all these things that have come in, which have stopped children thinking for themselves and just putting them in a railway line of how to do it. And of course, arts has fallen foul of that too, same sort of thing.
I'd agree.
Sorry,
Okay,
you were
yes?
Building on the discussion so far, is it time then to liberate art from the institution and go towards something that's founded on creativity and play?
Gosh.
Well, I'll answer that one. I think it is time for us to rethink the institutions that hold so much power over arts and arts engagement. If it is exclusionary, if it is not allowing for people to really have that personal, sense of discovery, peace, transformation, then something's clearly wrong. There are so many amazing shows that happen, or some of our greatest institutions that we know of people in the community who would be so transformed from the experience of getting to see and participate, and they're just not getting that. So how do we make access easier to arts? It seems obvious to me that there should be more arts engagement in the community. There should be more resources in the community for people to engage in art, and we should really think about the language of art. So we've kind of displayed here some of the, even for people who are in the arts, is this art? Is this visual arts? Is it not? I'm from the field of thinking that it's all art, and the more democratized it is, the better for society. So that's my thoughts on it.
No, I was just wondering what institutions the questioner was talking about.
Not cancelled. It's more art education become institutionalized.
The schools, you're talking of schools or art colleges or both.
Yeah, the whole
The formal routes for art education have become part of the institution that years ago it was rallying against. And is it time to leave that?
can I
Right, yeah,
comment
there you
on that
go.
one? I think that the root of what you're picking up on, it's finance. You know, as resources become slimmer and slimmer, and you have to fight harder and harder to come up with your numbers and show product and how it's working, confidence goes in the teaching community. There's so much that has to be justified. You know, a little bit like, is it a drawing of a dog or not? Does it look like a dog? They're having to justify everything they do, and that's not what makes good creative learning. Creative learning is another space. So I think you're picking up on something, but I am absolutely terrified that art education from junior to postgraduate is going to become private. I can see it heading in that direction because it becomes harder and harder to justify people who aren't justify to people who aren't artists why you need this massive budget. When I was at Chelsea, there was a study done which quite literally was to do with the space a student needed, the physical space. So for most subjects studied, you need a desk and possibly a bookshelf. If you're going to be a sculptor, you need at least 500 square foot. You know, you cannot, it's not a luxury, it's essential. It's not justifiable. The money, you can't justify it in terms of a budget. So you have to have incredible confidence and bravery to say, if we're going to have the arts, we need to have the arts properly. The results are evident. You know, we can all see how good it is when it's working. So what I would be calling for, a little bit like my friend said here, is confidence. I want confidence in the museums to put on good shows of new people who are exciting. I want confidence in art schools to teach properly. I want confidence in schools to say, we need the paper, we need the crayons, we need the time, we need the staff. It's about confidence. And artists are the very best at working with nothing. We can do extraordinary things with tiny budgets. We don't need much, but we need what we need. That's how I felt when you asked your question.
Yes, I mean, I think of prison artwork made with matchsticks. That's very artistic. Oh, beautiful, great structures, huge.
You reminded me of something incredible. My butcher in Vauxhall, I never asked how he knew, but when he found out I was a sculptor, he started showing me sculptures made. It looked like they were made of ivory, but it turned out they were made of chicken bones. And they were carvings in chicken bone done in prison.
Billington,
Because that's all they had. My dad used to say you can define an artist quite easily. You stick them in an empty room. Within about half an hour, they will have found something to make art out of. You know,
spiders.
you have to do it. And, you know, joy. All children deserve that.
I think we have time for one more question, and the gentleman in the front with the lovely cap.
George Ferguson. George Ferguson from Tobacco Factory in Bristol and the RWA, the Royal West of England Academy. The question of politicians and art, and I have to agree in general with Nicola, but I think the other day I got Chris Bryant, who ironically is the Minister for Everything Technology, Arts and Tourism. Not sport.
The natural group.
Absolutely, yeah, not sport. And his sister, by the way, is the president of the Royal Academy. He came to the Winter's Tale, only part of it because of time, at the Tobacco Factory, had genuine tears in his eyes at the end of it. He came to the Paul Vézelay exhibition at the RWA. He didn't have tears in his eyes, but he was clearly moved and learned a lot from it. It's a matter of getting to the individual rather than to the politician as in general. And I think it's up to all of us to get to our politicians and to educate them. I mean, our MP was a good cellist. I think there is our recent MP. I think don't totally generalize about politicians. Let's engage them. Let's get them to cry.
So I would say, yes, thank you for that. And I'm glad that you engaged with the individual. But the day that I hear him standing up talking about the need for a better budget in schools for the arts, I'll be impressed, basically.
Well, there we have it. I think we have our actions, all of us, to think about over our lunch. What can we all do to make sure that people understand the value of art and where the art works? Who can we speak to? What kind of conversations can we start up in our communities to move this conversation forward? I think what's clear is that we all do have a responsibility. So with that, I'd like you to thank our panelists from this morning, each of our speakers, for their wonderful presentations with a little applause. And now we're going to break for lunch. Do you want to come and say anything, Johnny? No? All right, so we're going to break for lunch now. So those of you who have booked, we're having lunch outside. In that area, I'm not quite sure what it's called. No.
But there we go. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Lisa. That was wonderful. So yes, please do take a moment to enjoy some lunch. If you are thinking of pre-booking, enjoying lunch, then we are all together in the tent next door. Yeah. If you're here and happy just to perambulate, I'm sure there's everything we can do for you as well. It's a fantastic exhibition. And I'm caused to mind to just point you towards Zena Holloway's work by Rootful, and she's here today if you want to speak to her about this practice. It's a non-hydrocarbon-based sculpture, which we invited by open submission, and it's going to be on the beach in Lowestoft in a few weeks' time. So do have a look at that as well and enjoy the rest of the show. We are back here at...
Well, lunch is for 1 hour.
That is true.
So we're running at half an hour late.
Oh, are you?
Yes, we are.
So it might be quite a short lunch, team. So without further ado, when would we like to be back here? Because Ellie's in charge of this, really. I think we should try and keep to our timetable if we can. Terrific. So when would you like us back? Okay. We're going to go for 45 minutes, team. It's a terrific lunch. But with the conversation. Okay, 1, 2, 3, go.